For most of human history, hunger was not a problem to be solved. It was simply the air that life moved through. And that raises a quiet question. If hunger was the natural condition of the human animal for hundreds of thousands of years, what does that tell us about the bodies we carry today, and the meals we've come to believe are necessary, and the deep biological rhythms that still pulse quietly beneath everything we think we know about eating? There is a belief, so common it has become invisible, that human beings need to eat 3 times a day: breakfast in the morning, a meal at midday, dinner in the evening. This rhythm feels ancient, feels biological, feels like something written into the body at a level deeper than culture. But if you follow that belief all the way back through time, back past the invention of agriculture, back past the first cities, back past the earliest written records, back into the long, dark corridor of human prehistory that stretches for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone kept records of anything, you find something surprising. You find that 3 meals a day is a very recent invention. Not recent in the way that smartphones are recent, or even recent in the way that democracy is recent. Recent in the way that the blink of an eye is recent when measured against the full sweep of geological time. The human species, in its current biological form, has existed for somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years. Agriculture, the practice of deliberately cultivating plants and keeping animals for food, emerged only about 10,000 years ago. That means that for roughly 90% of the time that anatomically modern humans have walked the earth, there were no farms, no grain stores, no orchards, no reliable harvests, no granaries, no markets, no kitchens, no ovens, and no concept of a scheduled meal. There was only the land and the animals that moved across it, and the plants that grew wild within it, and the human groups that moved through both, eating when food was available and going without when it was not. This is not a romantic picture. It is not a picture of abundance or ease, but it is the picture that shaped the human body, the human metabolism, the human brain, the human gut, and the deep biological instructions that still govern how your body handles food, how it stores energy, how it responds to scarcity, and how it processes the act of eating itself. To understand why you feel hungry at certain times, why your energy rises and falls across the day, why your body responds to a large meal in the way that it does, you have to go back to that long period of time when eating was not a scheduled event, but an unpredictable one. When food was not a certainty, but a possibility. When the human animal was not a consumer of regular meals, but a creature navigating a landscape of feast and famine, abundance and shortage, eating and not eating, in a rhythm that had nothing to do with clocks or meal times, and everything to do with what the land provided on any given day. Sit with that for a moment. Let it settle quietly. 200,000 years. That is how long the human body has been essentially what it is today. And for the first 190,000 of those years, no one ate breakfast. The earliest humans were members of small, mobile groups. The precise size of these groups has been the subject of considerable anthropological study and debate, but the evidence gathered from observations of modern hunter-gatherer communities, from the ecological constraints of prehistoric environments, and from genetic data about ancient population structures, suggests that the typical band numbered somewhere between 15 and 50 individuals. These were not isolated families. They were extended kinship groups, fluid in membership, capable of breaking apart and rejoining as conditions demanded. They moved across large territories, following the seasonal availability of food resources, and their relationship with eating was shaped entirely by the rhythms of the natural world, rather than by any human-imposed schedule. In environments like the African savannah, which is where many researchers believe the modern human lineage spent a significant portion of its formative evolutionary history, food was never evenly distributed across time. There were seasons of relative abundance, when fruits ripened and game was fat and plant foods were available in quantities that allowed for eating beyond immediate need. And there were seasons of genuine scarcity, when the land offered little, when water sources dried up, when the animals that humans hunted moved elsewhere, or became difficult to find, when the calories required simply to survive had to be drawn from the body's own stores rather than from any external source. This oscillation between plenty and scarcity was not an occasional disruption of an otherwise stable food supply. It was the fundamental structure of the food supply itself. The human body evolved inside this structure. It was shaped by it over hundreds of thousands of years, in the same way that river shapes the landscape it flows through, slowly and completely and without any particular design. The result is a body that is extraordinarily well adapted to managing irregular eating, a body that can go long periods without food and remain functional, a body that stores energy efficiently when food is available and draws on those stores intelligently when food is not. A body, in other words, that was built for a world where 3 meals a day would have been an almost unimaginable luxury. Consider what a typical day might have looked like for a member of a hunter-gatherer band in Eastern Africa 200,000 years ago. The group wakes before full light, not because anyone has set an alarm, but because the body's internal clock, the same circadian rhythm that still governs your own waking and sleeping, responds to the gradual brightening of the sky. There is no morning meal waiting. There is no food stored from the previous day. Whatever was gathered or hunted yesterday was consumed when it was obtained, because there was no reliable way to preserve it, and because sharing food immediately is a social practice so deeply embedded in hunter-gatherer societies that the anthropological literature describes it as nearly universal across cultures. So the morning begins in a state that we would today call fasted. The stomach is empty. The blood glucose levels are low. The body has been running on stored energy through the night. And yet the individuals in this group are not incapacitated by hunger. They are not lying still, conserving energy, waiting to be fed. They are moving, they are planning. They are observing the landscape around them with careful attention. They are coordinating with each other, deciding where to go, what to look for, who will do what. The cognitive and physical demands of the day begin immediately, before any food has been consumed, and the body handles these demands through a set of metabolic mechanisms that are still active in every human being alive today. This is one of the most important and underappreciated facts about human biology. The fasted state, the state of not having eaten recently, is not a state of impairment for the human body. It is, in a very real evolutionary sense, the body's native operating condition for the first several hours of the active day. The metabolic processes that activate in the absence of recently consumed food, including the mobilization of stored fat for energy, the production of ketone bodies as an alternative fuel source for the brain, and the sharpening of sensory attention that some researchers believe is linked to hunger-driven neurological changes. These are not emergency responses to a crisis. They are the normal, expected, evolutionarily ancient operations of a body doing what bodies were designed to do in the morning hours before food has been found. Modern nutritional science has, for much of the past century, operated on the assumption that this fasted state is a condition to be corrected as quickly as possible, that breakfast is not merely a cultural habit, but a biological necessity, that going without food in the morning hours causes cognitive impairment, reduces physical performance, and places unnecessary stress on the body. And there is certainly evidence that for some individuals, particularly children in active growth phases and people with specific metabolic conditions, eating in the morning provides real benefits. But the broader assumption that regular, frequent eating is the natural and optimal pattern for all humans sits uneasily against the deep evolutionary history of the species, a history in which morning meals were the exception rather than the rule, and in which the body was required to perform its most demanding physical and cognitive work, not after eating, but before it. Let us move deeper into that ancient day. The foraging group has left its sleeping camp and is moving through the landscape, in environments that have been studied extensively by anthropologists, including the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa, the tropical forests of Central Africa and South America, the grasslands and woodlands of Australia, and various environments across Asia and the Americas. Foraging groups typically cover substantial distances on foot each day. Estimates based on pedometer studies of modern hunter-gatherers and on the physical evidence left by ancient humans suggest that daily walking distances of between 6 and 15 kilometers were common, and on hunting days the distances could be considerably greater. This movement is happening in a fasted state, or at best in a lightly fed state, if some small amount of food was found early in the day. The calories being burned through this movement are substantial, and yet the metabolic machinery to support it was already in place, because the body had been running in this mode, requiring significant physical output before significant caloric input for hundreds of thousands of years. The liver, which stores a form of glucose called glycogen and releases it steadily into the bloodstream to fuel muscle and brain function, is remarkably efficient at managing this process. The fat cells distributed throughout the body contain vast reserves of energy that can be mobilized when glycogen stores run low, and the hormonal systems that regulate hunger and satiety, including the signals sent by the stomach, the intestines, the liver, and the brain itself, are calibrated not to prevent all hunger, but to manage it, to allow the body to remain functional and alert even as hunger builds. Because in the evolutionary environment that produced these systems, hunger that triggered paralysis would have been quickly selected against. The first significant eating of the day, when it happened, might have occurred at any time. It might have been a handful of tubers dug from the ground mid-morning. It might have been fruit discovered on a tree that had not yet been stripped by birds or other animals. It might have been nothing at all until a more substantial food source was found in the afternoon or evening. The timing was determined entirely by what the environment offered, not by any internal schedule or social convention. And the quantity, when food was found, was often determined by availability rather than by any judgment about how much was appropriate to eat. In conditions of food scarcity, every calorie that could be obtained was worth obtaining. The instinct to eat as much as possible when food was available was not gluttony or lack of control. It was a sensible biological response to an environment in which the next meal was genuinely uncertain. This is a point that deserves careful attention, because it speaks directly to something many people experience in their own relationship with food. The feeling that hunger, once it begins, seems to generate a kind of urgency that is difficult to reason with, or the feeling that when particularly appealing food is present, eating beyond the point of comfort feels almost involuntary. These experiences are not character flaws. They are the operation of very old biological systems that were designed for a world where food was scarce, and where the correct response to its availability was to consume as much as possible, because the body had no way of knowing when the next opportunity would come. The hypothalamus, the small region deep in the brain that acts as the master regulator of hunger and metabolism, does not know that you live in a world where food is available at every hour of every day. It is running software that was written in a world where that was never true. The question of what early humans actually ate during the long Paleolithic period, the vast stretch of time that encompasses most of human evolutionary history, is one that has generated considerable scientific debate and a significant body of research. The evidence comes from multiple sources. Archaeological sites preserve animal bones that show the cut marks of stone tools, indicating that humans were processing and consuming animal flesh. Dental analysis of ancient human remains reveals patterns of wet and the chemical signatures of different foods absorbed into tooth enamel. Coprolid analysis, the study of fossilized feces, can reveal what was being consumed in remarkable detail, and a cetopic analysis of ancient bones allows researchers to reconstruct the broad outlines of diet by examining the ratios of different chemical isotopes incorporated into bone tissue over a lifetime of eating. What this evidence suggests, taken together, is that Paleolithic human diets were highly variable across different environments, time periods, but that most hunter-gatherer populations consumed a mix of plant and animal foods, with the balance between the two shifting, depending on the season, the geography, and the particular environment as which group was living. In tropical environments close to the equator, plant foods likely made up a larger proportion of the diet throughout the year. In more seasonal environments and at higher latitudes, animal foods, including not just muscle meat, but also organs, marrow and fat, were critically important, particularly in winter months when plant foods were unavailable. But across all of these dietary patterns, one feature was essentially universal. Eating was irregular. It was episodic. It was clustered around successful foraging or hunting events rather than distributed evenly across the day. A successful hunt might provide enough meat for an entire group to eat very substantially, more than they might normally consume in several days, and in conditions before refrigeration or reliable food preservation methods, much of this food would be consumed quickly, shared widely through your group, and little would remain the following day. Then the group might go a day or two with only minimal food before the next significant acquisition. This pattern of intermittent abundance and intermittent scarcity, sometimes called the feast and fast cycle, is reflected in the metabolic architecture of the human body in ways that are still being actively studied by researchers in fields ranging from endocrinology to evolutionary biology to nutrition science. One of the most telling reflections of this ancient eating pattern in the modern human body is the way that insulin, the hormone responsible for managing blood glucose levels, responds to eating and fasting. When food is consumed, particularly food containing carbohydrates, the digestive system breaks those carbohydrates down into glucose, which enters the bloodstream, raising blood glucose levels. The pancreas responds by releasing insulin, which signals cells throughout the body to take up glucose from the blood and use it for energy or store it for later use. This is a well-understood process, central to every discussion of nutrition and metabolic health. What's less often discussed in popular accounts is what happens during the periods between eating. When no food has been consumed for several hours, blood glucose levels gradually decline, insulin levels fall, and the body transitions into a different metabolic mode. The liver begins releasing stored glucose from its glycogen reserves. Fat cells begin releasing fatty acids into the bloodstream. The liver converts some of these fatty acids into ketone bodies, which can serve as fuel for the brain and other organs when glucose availability is low. These processes are not pathological. They're not signs that the body is under stress or that something has gone wrong. They are the body doing exactly what it evolved to do during the intervals between meals, which, for most of human history, were not the brief 1 to 3 hour gaps between a breakfast, a lunch and a dinner, but potentially gaps of 12, 16, 20, or even more hours between significant caloric intake. The liver's glycogen stores, under normal conditions, can sustain blood glucose levels for roughly 12 to 16 hours of fasting. This is not a coincidence. It is a design feature. The body stores enough glucose to get through a night of sleep and several hours of morning activity, which is precisely the period during which, for most of human history, no food would have been available. By the time those glycogen stores are running low, the body has already shifted substantially toward fat oxidation, drawing on the energy reserves stored in adipose tissue, which in a reasonably well-nourished individual contain enough calories to sustain life for weeks. The human body is, from a purely energetic standpoint, extraordinarily well equipped for going without food for extended periods. It is not well equipped, in the same evolutionary sense, for eating large quantities of refined carbohydrates multiple times per day, every day, without significant periods of metabolic rest. This mismatch between the environment the human metabolism shaped by and the environment most modern humans actually live in is sometimes called evolutionary mismatch, and it has become an increasingly important framework in discussions of modern metabolic diseases. The rates of type 2 diabetes, obesity, metabolic syndrome, and related conditions have risen dramatically across most of the industrialized world over the past century, and particularly over the past several decades. The causes of these changes are complex and are influenced by many factors, including changes in physical activity levels, changes in sleep patterns, changes in stress, changes in the composition of the food supply, and many others. But the dramatic increase in the frequency of eating and the near elimination of meaningful fasting periods from most people's daily lives is a feature of the modern food environment that differs fundamentally from the conditions under which human metabolism was shaped, and its consequences are beginning to be understood more clearly by researchers who are willing to look at human nutrition through the lens of evolutionary history. Let us return to the ancient landscape. It is afternoon. The foraging group has been moving through its territory for several hours. Some plant foods have been gathered and consumed along the way. Perhaps tubers were found and eaten on the spot, still gritty with soil, not peeled or cooked, consumed in the manner of most other primates encountering a food source immediately and without ceremony. Perhaps some fruit was found. Perhaps some insects or larvae, which are dense in protein and fat and were likely consumed opportunistically by ancient humans in much the same way they are by many modern hunter-gatherer peoples today. But a substantial meal has not yet been eaten. The stomach is not full. And yet, the group is functioning. They are communicating, observing, making decisions. They are reading the landscape with the particular attentiveness of people whose survival depends on noticing things. The bent grass that indicates an animal passed this way recently. The change in the colour of the soil that suggests water nearby. The birds flying in a particular pattern. that might indicate a fruiting tree or a carcass. This level of environmental attentiveness, this quality of sustained, quiet, patient observation, is in many ways the cognitive mode that the fasted brain was built for. There is a growing body of research suggesting that mild hunger sharpens certain cognitive functions, particularly those related to attention, memory formation, and spatial reasoning. The evolutionary logic behind this is clear enough. An animal that becomes cognitively dull when hungry is less able to find food, and therefore less likely to survive periods of scarcity. An animal that becomes more alert, more attentive, and more spatially aware when hungry has a significant advantage. The neurological mechanisms underlying this relationship between hunger and cognition include the action of hormones like ghrelin, which is produced by the stomach in response to emptiness, and which has been shown to have direct effects on the hippocampus and other brain regions involved in memory and attention. Ghrelin does not just make you aware that your stomach is empty, it actively modulates brain function in ways that may enhance the cognitive processes most useful for finding food. This is a remarkable thing to sit with quietly. The hunger you feel is not simply an unpleasant sensation to be silenced. It is, from a deep evolutionary perspective, a signal that activates a whole suite of biological responses, not all of them uncomfortable, some of them cognitively sharpening, that were designed to increase the likelihood of finding food. The restlessness that often accompanies hunger, the slightly heightened awareness, the increased interest in the environment. These are not failures of willpower. They are ancient biological programs running exactly as designed. As the afternoon deepens, the real possibility of a substantial meal begins to materialize. For much of human prehistory, the most significant caloric events of the day were associated with either successful hunting or with reaching a particularly productive gathering location. Hunting, in particular, was a high-stakes, high-effort activity that required coordination, patience, skill, and often considerable physical exertion, and it did not succeed every time. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies have found that hunting success rates vary considerably depending on the environment, the season, the prey species, and the skill of the hunters, but that failure is common. A hunting party might go out for an entire day and return with nothing, or they might return with a small animal that provides modest calories divided among many people, or on a successful day, they might return with a large animal that provides abundant food for the entire group. The unpredictability of this process is important. It means that the expectation of eating, the anticipatory certainty that a meal will arrive at a particular time, was essentially absent from ancient human experience. The relationship between effort and eatus was real but probabilistic. You might work hard and find food. You might work just as hard and find nothing. And the body was calibrated for both outcomes. It could sustain effort in the absence of eating, and it could respond to a large unexpected food acquisition with the full physiological arsenal of the feast response, the rapid stimulation of appetite that makes continued eating possible even after some food has already been consumed, the release of digestive enzymes, the activation of fat storage pathways, the deep sense of satisfaction and even drowsiness that follows a very substantial meal. That post-meal drowsiness is itself worth pausing on. The feeling of heaviness and sleepiness that descends after a large meal, sometimes called the postprandial dip, or more colloquially a food coma, has a genuine physiological basis. Blood is redirected to the digestive system to support the processing of the meal. Certain hormones, including serotonin and cholecystokinin, are released, which have calming and sedating effects. The body temperature rises slightly as the metabolic work of digestion begins, and the result is a state of reduced alertness and reduced motivation to move, which in the evolutionary context of a hunter-gatherer who has just consumed a large meal is entirely appropriate. The work of finding food is done. The food has been eaten. The body can now rest and direct its energy toward the demanding metabolic work of digestion, storage, and recovery. In many traditional cultures, and in many parts of the world, where the rhythms of life are still partially governed by the natural patterns of light and activity rather than by industrial schedules, a period of rest after the main meal of the day is not considered laziness or self-indulgence. It is considered normal, sensible, and biologically appropriate. The afternoon siesta found in Mediterranean and Latin American cultures, the practice of resting after the midday meal in many South Asian societies, the general acknowledgement in pre-industrial communities that the body needs to slow down after eating. These cultural practices are not merely habits. They are cultural expressions of a biological reality that the human body has observed for hundreds of thousands of years. The question of when the main meal of the day was eaten in prehistoric contexts is interesting and not entirely settled. The evidence from modern hunter-gatherer societies is somewhat varied. In some groups, the largest meal tends to be consumed in the late afternoon or evening after the day's foraging or hunting is complete. In others, particularly in environments where the midday heat makes afternoon movement difficult, the pattern may be somewhat different. But the consistent finding across nearly all documented hunter-gatherer societies is that there is typically one main meal per day, one event of substantial food consumption, rather than the 3 or more meals that have become standard in most industrialized societies. This is not to say that nothing else is eaten during the day. Small amounts of food consumed while foraging, a piece of fruit here, some roots there, a handful of seeds or nuts, can add up to a meaningful caloric contribution. But these opportunistic snacks are fundamentally different in character from a planned, seated, socially organized meal. They are incidental, accidental, dependent on what happens to be available at the moment. They do not constitute a second or third meal in any meaningful sense. They are simply calories absorbed opportunistically in the course of a day spent looking for the one substantial eating event that the body was actually designed around. The social dimension of that one substantial meal is worth exploring at some length, because food in early human communities was not merely nutrition. It was one of the primary arenas as which social relationships were created, maintained, and negotiated. The sharing of food is one of the most universal features of human social behavior, documented in every hunter-gatherer society that has been studied, and it appears to be extraordinarily ancient, far older than language or art or any of the other distinctly human cultural achievements. The social rules around food sharing, who shares with whom, who receives what portions, who has priority access to certain parts of an animal, how food is distributed within the group and between groups, these rules vary enormously from one society to another, but the fact that such rules exist, that food is not simply consumed by whoever finds it, but is distributed according to social logic, is essentially universal. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes a great deal of sense. In a world of unpredictable food availability, the ability to pool food resources across a group provides insurance against individual misfortune. The hunter who fails today may benefit from the success of another hunter. The gatherer who finds little today may be sustained by the abundance gathered by others. And the hunter who succeeds today, knowing that he may fail tomorrow, has reason to share his success broadly, building the social credit that will sustain him when the tables are turned. This reciprocal exchange, which anthropologists have called generalized reciprocity, is not merely a cultural nicety. It is a survival strategy of profound effectiveness, one that allowed small human groups to buffer the inherent unpredictability of a foraging subsistence and to sustain themselves through periods of scarcity that would have been fatal to individuals acting alone. The meal, then, was not just a nutritional event. It was a social ceremony. It was the daily occasion on which the group came together, shared what had been found, and reinforced the bonds of mutual obligation and trust that made collective survival possible. The act of eating together, of receiving food from others, and of giving food to others was embedded in a web of social meaning that extended far beyond the simple transfer of calories. Archaeological evidence of ancient hearths, some of which date back to control of fire by human ancestors more than 1 million years ago, and which become increasingly common in the archaeological record of the past 300,000 years, suggests that fire and the cooking and sharing of food around it have been central features of human social life for an extraordinarily long time. The hearth is worth thinking about as a concept. It is the fixed point around which the otherwise mobile life of a foraging band briefly crystallized each day. It was the place where food was brought and prepared and shared. It was the place where the group gathered in the evening, after the day's movement was done. It was warm, it was light in the darkness, it was safe in the way that the open landscape at night was not safe. And it was the setting for what may have been the most important social moment of the day, the gathering of the group around food. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued in his book on the evolution of cooking that the control of fire and the cooking of food may have been among the most transformative developments in human evolutionary history, not because cooking made food taste better, though it did, and not only because cooking made food safer by killing pathogens, though it did that too, but because cooking dramatically increased the caloric availability of food. Raw food, even nutritious food, requires far more digestive work to extract its calories than cooked food. The process of cooking, of applying heat to plant and animal foods, begins the work of breaking down cell walls, denaturing proteins, and gelatinizing starches before the food even enters the digestive system. The result is that cooked food yields more usable calories per gram than the same food consumed raw. This increase in caloric efficiency may have had profound consequences for human evolution. It may have allowed the human digestive system to become relatively smaller, redirecting metabolic energy from digestion to the brain, which is the most metabolically expensive organ in the body and which grew dramatically in size over the course of human evolutionary history. It may have reduced the time that had to be spent chewing, which in our closest primate relatives can consume several hours per day, freeing time for other activities. And it may have enabled the human body to extract adequate nutrition from a single substantial meal each day, rather than requiring the near-continuous foraging and eating that characterizes the lives of most other large primates. A gorilla, for example, spends roughly half of its waking hours eating. This is not because gorillas lack discipline or because gorilla food is unusually delicious. It's because the raw plant foods that make up most of a gorilla's diet are relatively low in caloric density, and require extensive chewing and a very large digestive system to extract enough energy to sustain a large body. Gorillas and other great apes have gut volumes that are proportionally much larger than human gut volumes, reflecting the digestive demands of a largely raw plant-based diet. Humans, by contrast, have remarkably small guts relative to our body size, which suggests that at some point in our evolutionary history, we began regularly consuming foods that yielded more calories per unit of digestive effort. Cooking is the most likely explanation. If cooking is what made it possible for humans to sustain themselves on one main meal per day, then fire and the social gathering around fire was not merely a convenience or a comfort. It was part of the metabolic foundation of the human way of life. The evening meal prepared at the hearth, shared among the members of the band, consuming perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 calories in a single eating event, was the culmination and the nutritional center of the human day. Everything that came before it, the hours of movement and searching, gathering, the small opportunistic snacks, the long-fasted morning, the gradually building hunger of the afternoon, was in some sense preparation for this event. And the body was designed to handle this architecture of the day. The long fast followed by the substantial feast, followed by the rest and sleep, with remarkable efficiency. It is interesting to consider what the experience of that evening meal might have felt like, not in a romanticized way, but in a genuinely biological sense. After a day of movement and caloric restriction, the appetite that was present when food was finally available was real and urgent. The pleasure of eating, which is not merely a psychological phenomenon but a deeply biological one, driven by the release of dopamine and other neurotransmitters in the brain's reward circuits, was likely intense. The relief of hunger is, in biological terms, genuinely pleasurable, and the more intense the hunger, the more intense the relief. The food itself, whether roasted tubers or shared meat or gathered plant foods, would have been consumed with a degree of genuine satisfaction that is perhaps difficult to access, in a world where food is always available and hunger is rarely allowed to build to any real intensity. There is a paradox here that is worth noticing. The very abundance and convenience of food in the modern world, which seems like an unambiguous good, may actually diminish the subjective pleasure of eating by eliminating the hunger that gives eating its most fundamental reward. When you're never truly hungry, the relief of eating is never truly satisfying. The meal becomes a habit rather than an event, a scheduled obligation rather than a genuine need fulfilled. And the deep biological systems that were designed around the cycle of hunger and satiety, the ghrelin that rises and sharpens attention, the dopamine that rewards the finding and consuming of food, the serotonin that creates the calm satisfaction of fullness, these systems are never fully activated because the cycle they were designed to manage is never fully completed. This is, of course, a philosophical observation rather than a prescription. The suggestion is not that people should deliberately starve themselves in order to enjoy their meals more, though the growing field of intermittent fasting research does suggest that deliberate periods of caloric restriction may have genuine health benefits that go beyond simple weight management. The observation is simply that the human experience of food, the way it feels to be hungry and then to eat, was shaped in a world very different from the one most modern humans inhabit, and that understanding this history illuminates something real about why the relationship between modern people and food is so often complicated, conflicted, and difficult. The transition from the Paleolithic way of eating, the episodic, irregular, one main meal per day pattern of the forager, to something resembling the modern pattern of multiple scheduled daily meals did not happen all at once. It happened in stages over thousands of years, driven by a series of transformations in the way humans organize the relationship with food. The most important of these transformations was the agricultural revolution, which began approximately 10,000 years ago in several regions of the world, more or less simultaneously, or at least in close enough succession that the broad pattern is clear. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, in the Yellow River Valley of China, in the highlands of Mesoamerica, in the Andes, in the Indus Valley, and in several regions of Africa, human groups began the systematic cultivation of plants and the herding of animals in ways that differed fundamentally from anything that had come before. Agriculture did not emerge because someone had a brilliant idea about efficiency. It emerged gradually through a long process of intensification of plant use, selective encouragement of useful species, and increasingly deliberate management of plant and animal populations driven by a combination of environmental pressures and human ingenuity. The end of the last glacial maximum, roughly 12,000 years ago, brought climate changes that altered the distribution of wild food resources across many parts of the world, creating pressures on human populations that may have pushed some groups toward more intensive exploitation of particular food sources. Population growth, which appears to have accelerated in some regions toward the end of the Paleolithic, created competition for resources that may also have incentivized more intensive food production strategies. Whatever the causes, the consequences of the shift to agriculture were profound and in many ways paradoxical. On one hand, agriculture allowed human populations to grow dramatically. The ability to produce food, rather than simply to find it, meant that a given area of land could support far more people than had been possible under a foraging subsistence. The world's human population, which had been growing very slowly for most of the Paleolithic, and may have numbered only a few million at the dawn of agriculture, grew to hundreds of millions over the millennia that followed, and eventually to billions. Agriculture made possible the cities, the writing, the specialized labor, the complex societies and technologies that constitute what we call civilization. On the other hand, the skeletal evidence from early agricultural communities tells a more complicated story. Compared to their hunter-gatherer predecessors, early farmers in many parts of the world show evidence of poorer health, not better. Their skeletons are smaller on average. Their teeth show more decay and more evidence of nutritional deficiency. The markers of chronic physical stress in bones and joints are more pronounced, and there is widespread evidence of the infectious diseases that spread more easily in settled, dense populations than they ever could in small mobile bands. The transition to agriculture was not, from a strictly biological standpoint, an obvious improvement in the health of the average individual. It was a trade in which individuals gave up some degree of health, dietary diversity, and physical freedom in exchange for the security, the greater food reliability, and the social complexity that settled agricultural life provided. The relationship between agriculture and eating patterns is particularly interesting. The cultivation of grain crops, wheat and barley in the Middle East, rice in Asia, maize in the Americas, millet in Africa, introduced a new kind of food into the human diet. Grains are nutritious, storable, and highly calorie-dense relative to their weight and volume. They can be grown in large quantities, harvested, dried, and kept for months or even years. These properties made grain the backbone of agricultural civilization, The food that supported the populations of the great ancient empires, the food that could be taxed and traded and stored in state granaries to provision armies and sustain cities. But grain also changed the structure of eating in ways that had no precedent in the evolutionary history of the species. Grain must be processed before it can be eaten. It must be ground into flour, and that flour must be mixed with water and usually cooked in some form, either as bread, porridge, flatbread, or some other preparation. This processing requires time, equipment, and effort. It is, in other words, a domestic manufacturing process, something that happens at home or in a dedicated facility on a regular schedule to produce a food that will be consumed on a similarly regular schedule. The introduction of grain-based staple foods into the human diet was accompanied by, and may have helped create, the idea of meal times. When food is wild and must be found each day, the timing of eating is entirely dictated by when food is found. But when food is stored and must be prepared, the timing of eating can be, and eventually must be, scheduled. You prepare bread in the morning and eat it. You prepare porridge at midday and eat it. You prepare the evening meal and eat it. The regularity of agricultural food production imposed a regularity of eating that had no equivalent in the forager world. It's probably not coincidental that many of the earliest documentary records of human eating habits, dating from the ancient civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, describe 2 or sometimes 3 meals per day as a common pattern among at least some segments of the population. Ancient Egyptian workers, based on ration records from construction projects including the building of the pyramids, received grain, bread, beer, vegetables, and sometimes meat as part of their daily provisions, distributed in portions that suggest at least 2, and possibly 3, eating occasions per day. Ancient Greek and Roman sources describe a light morning meal, a midday meal, and a more substantial evening meal as the general pattern for the urban and rural population, though the content and character of these meals varied enormously depending on social class, occupation, and region. But it is important to note that even within these early agricultural societies, the shift to multiple daily meals was not universal, was not complete, and was certainly not experienced in the same way by all segments of the population. The elite classes of ancient civilizations, who had consistent access to varied and abundant food, probably did eat more regularly and more substantially than the peasant farmers and labourers who form the majority of the population. For the agricultural poor, who formed the vast bulk of the ancient and medieval world's population, the diet was often monotonous, the quantities were often insufficient, and genuine hunger remained a common experience. The 3-meal-a-day pattern was, for much of recorded history, an aspiration of the comfortable classes rather than a reality for most people. In medieval Europe, for example, the evidence from historical records, from literary sources, and from the archaeology of food remains suggest that the typical peasant diet was heavily grain-based, nutritionally limited, and subject to significant seasonal variation. In good years, a peasant family might eat reasonably well, at least in terms of caloric sufficiency, typically with 2 main meals per day, a midday meal and an evening meal, supplemented by a small morning portion of bread or grain porridge. In bad years, which came with alarming frequency in pre-modern agricultural societies due to harvest failures, warfare, disease, and a dozen other disasters, genuine starvation was not uncommon. The food security that agriculture promised in theory was in practice far from guaranteed for most of the people who actually grew the food. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries was, in the history of human eating, another major inflection point. The movement of large numbers of people into urban factory environments changed the conditions of food production, food access, and eating timing in ways that had no precedent. Factory workers could not interrupt their shift to forage for food or to prepare a meal from scratch. They needed food that was available quickly, in fixed locations, at scheduled times. The industrial workplace imposed a rigid daily schedule, and the eating patterns of industrial workers had to fit around that schedule rather than around the natural rhythms of hunger and food availability. The factory lunch break as a social institution emerged from this context. The idea that workers would leave the factory floor at a specific hour, eat a meal of determined duration, and return to work was a negotiated arrangement between the demands of industrial production and the biological reality that human beings need to eat during a working day. Similar considerations shaped the timing of breakfast and dinner in industrial households. Breakfast was eaten before the early morning departure for work. Dinner was eaten after the return from work in the evening. These times were fixed not by biology or by hunger, but by the schedule of industrial labour. The 20th century intensified and universalised these patterns in ways that have created the food environment that most people in the industrialised world now inhabit. The development of industrial food processing, refrigeration, and global supply chains made an extraordinary variety of food available at all times, in all seasons, in quantities that would have been literally unimaginable to any human being who had ever lived before. The rise of the supermarket, stocked with thousands of different food products, available continuously regardless of season or location, represented a rupture in the relationship between humans and food so complete that it is difficult to fully appreciate just how dramatic a change it represents. For the entirety of human prehistory and for most of recorded history, the question of whether food would be available was a genuine, pressing, and sometimes existential concern. Not an abstract worry, not a theoretical possibility, but a real and constant background presence in the experience of daily life. The farmer worried about rain and pests and harvest. The forager tracked game and seasonal fruiting and the state of the water sources. The medieval peasant watched the sky and the crops and the stores in the granary with the vigilance born of real experience with hunger. That vigilance and the metabolic and neurological systems that supported it, the heightened attention to food cues, the strong motivational pull toward eating when food is available, the deep pleasure of satisfying hunger, the efficient storage of excess calories as fat against future scarcity. These systems are still present in every modern human being. They're not optional features that can be switched off by intellectual understanding. They are the hardware of the human animal, built over hundreds of thousands of years for a world that no longer exists for most people, but which shaped the body so completely that its influence remains in every hunger pang, every craving, every tendency to eat beyond the point of a comfort when food is unusually good or unusually plentiful. The science of chronobiology, which studies the relationship between biological processes and time, has in recent decades illuminated some of the specific mechanisms through which the timing of eating affects human health. The human body is not simply a calorie processing machine that operates the same way regardless of when calories are consumed. It is a highly time-aware system, governed by a master biological clock located in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus, which synchronizes thousands of physiological processes including the processes of digestion, metabolism, and energy storage, to a roughly 24-hour cycle coordinated with the cycle of light and darkness. Within this daily cycle, the body is metabolically prepared for food at certain times and not at others. In the early morning, shortly after waking, insulin sensitivity is typically high, meaning the body is particularly well equipped to process carbohydrates efficiently. As the day progresses, insulin sensitivity tends to decline somewhat, and the body's preparedness to handle a large caloric load changes accordingly. In the late evening and overnight hours, the metabolic machinery of digestion and energy processing slows significantly. Because of most of human evolutionary history, those were the hours of sleep and rest, not the hours of eating. Eating at times that are misaligned with the body's circadian metabolic preparation, and in particular eating large meals in the late evening or at night, has been associated in a growing body of research with a range of negative metabolic outcomes, including impaired glucose tolerance, increased fat storage, disrupted sleep, and higher long-term risk of metabolic disease. These findings are consistent with the evolutionary picture of a body designed to eat mainly in the daylight hours, with most or all of the day's calories consumed in a window that aligned with the active, light-exposed portion of the day, and with the overnight fasting period functioning as a genuine metabolic rest that allowed the body to clear glucose from circulation, mobilize fat stores, initiate cellular repair processes, and prepare for the following day. The field of research, now broadly called time-restricted eating, or intermittent fasting in its various forms, is in many ways an attempt to work with rather than against these deep biological rhythms. The various protocols that have been studied, including the 16 to 8 pattern of 16 hours of fasting followed by 8 hours of eating, the 5 to 2 pattern of 5 normal eating days, followed by 2 days of very restricted intake, and the more extreme approaches of alternate day fasting or extended multi-day fasts are all, at some level, attempts to reintroduce into modern life something approximating the irregular fasting and feasting pattern that characterized human eating for most of evolutionary history. The research results from these approaches have been, on balance, encouraging, though the field is still young and many questions remain unresolved. Studies in both human subjects and animal models have found that intermittent fasting can improve insulin sensitivity, reduce inflammatory markers, support weight loss and maintenance of a healthy body composition, improve certain markers of cardiovascular health, enhance certain aspects of cognitive function, and in some animal models extend lifespan. The mechanisms underlying these benefits are not fully understood, but they appear to involve the activation of metabolic pathways, including autophagy, the cellular process of breaking down and recycling damaged cellular components that are triggered by fasting, and that appear to have important roles in cellular maintenance, disease prevention, and healthy aging. Autophagy, a concept worth pausing on in this context, because it speaks to one of the deeper consequences of the human body's long, evolutionary experience of irregular eating. Autophagy, whose name comes from the Greek for self-eating, is a process by which cells identify damaged or dysfunctional components, including misfolded proteins and damaged organelles, and break them down for recycling. This process is activated and accelerated during fasting, particularly during extended fasting, and it appears to play important roles in protection against cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, metabolic disorders, and the general deterioration of cellular function that we associate with aging. The discovery of autophagy and its regulation earned the cell biologist Yoshinori Osumi the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in the year 2016. and since then the field has grown rapidly. What is becoming clear from this research is that the cellular housekeeping functions performed during fasting are not merely maintenance tasks. They are essential processes that appear to require the fasting condition to operate effectively. A cell that is continuously supplied with the nutrients and continuously engaged in the work of growth and energy processing does not have the same metabolic freedom to divert resources to repair and recycling. Continuous eating, which is what the modern food environment tends to produce, may inadvertently suppress these processes by keeping the body in a perpetual state of a nutrient abundance that does not activate the repair pathways that evolved to operate during the fasting intervals between ancient meals. It is worth thinking about this in terms of the body as a system. Any complex system requires not only active operation, but also maintenance and repair. A factory that runs its machinery continuously without scheduled downtime for maintenance will accumulate damage and malfunctions faster than one that incorporates regular maintenance windows. The human body is vastly more complex than any factory, and its maintenance systems are vastly more sophisticated, but the basic principle applies. The body needs periods of not eating, periods of fasting to activate and complete certain essential maintenance and repair processes that cannot operate efficiently in the well-fed state. The regular fasting that characterized ancient human eating was not merely a consequence of food scarcity. It was, from the body's perspective, an essential feature of the operational cycle, not a deficiency to be corrected. There is a thread of this understanding running through many traditional religious and cultural practices around the world. Virtually every major religious tradition includes some form of prescribed fasting, some period during which eating is restricted or eliminated as a spiritual or purificatory practice. Ramadan in Islam, Yom Kippur in Judaism, Lent and various fasting days in Christianity, Ekadashi fasting in Hinduism, the many fasting practices of Buddhist and other traditions. These are not merely cultural survivals from more austere times. They reflect, whether by design or by accumulated cultural wisdom, an awareness that the human relationship with food has an important rhythmic dimension, that periods of eating and periods of not eating are both meaningful and necessary, and that the human body and spirit benefit from the deliberate management of this rhythm. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, in his structural analyses of cultural practices around food, noted that the distinction between the raw and the cooked was one of the fundamental structuring principles of human culture, a way of marking the boundary between nature and civilization, between the animal and the human. It is interesting to consider whether a similar structural importance might be attributed to the distinction between eating and fasting, between the feast and the fast, as a rhythm that has organized human experience since before there was any culture to speak of, operating at the level of biology long before it was elevated to the level of meaning. Let us move now from the biological and anthropological dimensions of this story toward its social and cultural expressions. Because the way that food is eaten, when it is eaten, who eats together, how it's prepared and shared and ritualized, these are not merely practical questions. They are some of the deepest expressions of human culture, and they have been shaped not only by biology and ecology, but by the entire sweep of social, economic, and technological history. In ancient hunter-gatherer societies, as we have discussed, the evening meal was the social centre of the day. It was the occasion on which the group came together, shared what had been gathered and hunted, reinforced social bonds, and engaged in the storytelling, discussion, and communal activity that built and maintained the social fabric of the group. The anthropological literature on hunter-gatherer societies consistently emphasizes the centrality of sharing and communal eating to the social life of these groups. Food was not private property in the way that it is in most modern societies. It was a shared resource, and the obligation to share food with others, particularly with those who had not eaten, was one of the most fundamental social norms. This social meaning of eating together is not something that disappeared. With the transition to agriculture and sedentary life, it evolved and changed and became embedded in the far more complex social structures of agricultural civilization. But the fundamental human tendency to use food as a vehicle for social bonding, to mark important occasions with shared meals, to express care and hospitality through the provision of food, persisted through every transformation of the food system. The elaborate banquets of ancient Rome, the feasting practices of medieval courts, the Thanksgiving dinner of the American tradition, the Eid al-Fitr feast that marks the end of Ramadan, the wedding breakfast, the funeral luncheon, the birthday cake. These are all expressions of a social instinct that goes back hundreds of thousands of years to the hearth around which the first human communities gathered each evening to share what the day had provided. But the social meaning of eating has also been shaped by the inequalities of the social structures within which it occurs. In stratified societies, access to food has always been one of the most visible and consequential dimensions of social inequality. The quantity and quality of food available to the wealthy has always differed dramatically from that available to the poor. The timing and number of meals, the variety of foods consumed, the presence or absence of meat and other luxury items, all of these have served throughout history as markers of social position, indices of wealth and power that were enacted daily through the act of eating. In ancient Mesopotamia, the earliest written records include lists of food rations distributed to workers and household members, and the variation in these rations by social rank is striking. In ancient Egypt, the diet of a pharaoh and the diet of a field labourer were not merely quantitatively different, but qualitatively different, in ways that reflected and reinforced the entire social order. In medieval Europe, the elaborate system of food symbolism and food regulation, including the designation of certain foods as fit for the upper classes and others as suitable only for the poor, the elaborate rituals of feasting and hospitality at the courts of kings and nobles, and the periodic enforcement of sumptuary laws regulating what different classes were permitted to consume, all of these reflect the deep entanglement of eating with social hierarchy and power. The 3 meals a day pattern that eventually became standard in many industrialized societies was, for a long time, itself a marker of social status. In early modern Europe, 3 meals a day was the prerogative of the comfortable classes. Labourers and peasants typically ate 2 meals or fewer, not by choice but by necessity. The expansion of 3 meal a day eating to the general population was a consequence of rising living standard in the industrial age, and it happened gradually over the course of the 19th and into the 20th century. As incomes rose, food became more affordable, and the social aspirations of the working class increasingly included the eating habits of the middle class. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the extraordinary transformation that this represents. For most of human history, eating once a day or fewer was the norm for most people. Not because it was believed to be optimal, but because that was what the food supply permitted. The aspiration to eat more frequently was always present, because the biological drives toward eating when food is available are powerful and consistent. What changed was not human desire, but human capacity. the productive capacity of the food system to provide enough food, reliably enough, cheaply enough for the majority of people to eat as often as they wanted. By the middle of the 20th century in much of North America and Western Europe, and by the end of the 20th century in much of the rest of the industrialized world, the ancient condition of involuntary food scarcity had been, for practical purposes, eliminated for a large fraction of the world's population. The result was that for the first time in human history, the default condition for most people in the societies was continuous food availability rather than intermittent food scarcity, and the metabolic and behavioral systems that evolved in conditions of scarcity. The strong appetite signals, the tendency to eat beyond immediate need when food is available, the efficient storage of excess calories as fat. These systems found themselves operating in an environment that had made them, in an important sense, obsolete. This mismatch is not merely theoretical. Its consequences can be read in the public health data of the past half-century. The dramatic rise in obesity, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and related conditions that has occurred across the industrialized world over this period corresponds closely to the period during which continuous food availability, combined with the proliferation of highly processed, calorie-dense, nutritionally simplified food products specifically engineered to stimulate appetite and override satiety signals, has become the normal food environment for most people. The biology that served ancient humans so well in conditions of scarcity is, in conditions of abundance, generating outcomes that were never part of the design. The story of how the human body processes food, and how that processing is affected by the timing and frequency of eating, is also deeply connected to the story of the human gut microbiome, a subject that has attracted enormous research attention in recent years, and that is revealing layers of complexity in the relationship between eating, bacteria, and human health that would have been entirely unimagined even a generation ago. The human gut contains somewhere between 30 and 40 trillion microbial cells, roughly comparable in number to the total number of human cells in the body, representing thousands of different species of bacteria, archaea, fungi, and other microorganisms. This community of microorganisms is not merely a passenger in the human body. It is an active participant in the processes of digestion, immune function, neurological signaling, and metabolic regulation, performing functions that the human genome alone could not support. The composition and activity of the gut microbiome are influenced by many factors, including genetics, early life experience, antibiotic exposure, stress, and many others. But one of the most important influences is diet, both what is eaten and when it is eaten. The gut microbiome has its own circadian rhythms, synchronized with the host's eating and sleep cycles, and disruption of these rhythms, for example, by eating at night, when the gut microbiome is in its rest phase, can have measurable consequences for gut microbial composition and function, and for the host's metabolic health. Studies have found that the gut microbiomes of hunter-gatherer populations are significantly more diverse than those of people living in industrialized societies, reflecting the greater dietary diversity and the different eating patterns of foraging life, and that this greater diversity is associated with better immune function and lower rates of inflammatory and metabolic disease. The ancient practice of eating a wide variety of different plant foods, consuming different types of fiber and complex carbohydrates that feed different microbial populations in the gut, maintaining regular fasting periods that allow the gut microbiome its own circadian rest. These practices shaped the composition of the gut microbiome over hundreds of thousands of years of co-evolution between humans and their microbial companions. The modern industrial diet, high in refined carbohydrates, low in diverse plant fibres, continuous in its provision of calories with few significant fasting intervals, has created conditions that select for a different, and most evidence suggests, less healthy gut microbial community as the night deepens and the story continues its slow movement through time. It is worth returning briefly to the simplest and most direct expression of everything that has been discussed, the experience of a single human body moving through a single day in the ancient world. The sun has set. The sky for the savannah has deepened from the brilliant orange and red of sunset to the profound blue-black of an African night. The stars are extraordinary, uncountable, filling the sky from horizon to horizon in a way that is nearly impossible to imagine for anyone who has grown up in a light-polluted city. There is no artificial light. The world is lit only by the fire, the steady warm glow of the hearth around which the group has gathered. The meal has been eaten. The animals brought back from the day's hunting have been roasted and shared. The gathered plant foods has been divided and consumed. There is a sense of completion, of fullness, of the day's purpose fulfilled. The work of finding food, which was the central organising purpose of the day, is done. The bodies around the fire are warm and replete. The children who have fallen asleep close to the adults. The conversation around the fire is slow and easy, without urgency. The night sounds of the savannah, insects and distant animal calls, and the occasional sound of wind in the dry grass form a continuous background. And the body, having been fed after many hours of fasting and movement, is doing what bodies do in this state. The processes of digestion are engaged, converting the day's food into the energy and structural materials the body needs. The storage of energy for the coming night and the coming day is underway. The hormonal signals that produce sleepiness, serotonin, cholecystokinin, melatonin beginning to rise as the firelight dims, are moving through the blood. The brain, which has been alert and attentive all day, is beginning its transition toward the slow wave sleep that will consolidate the day's memories, allow the clearance of metabolic waste from the brain, and restore the attentional systems for the next day's work. This is the architecture of the human day in its evolutionary design. Long fast in the morning, gradual building of hunger through a day of movement and foraging, one main eating event in the afternoon or evening around the social focal point of the fire, and then sleep. Everything else, every variation, every elaboration, every complication that culture and history and economics have introduced over the past 10,000 years has been layered on top of this fundamental biological structure. And that structure is still there, still operating, still exerting its influence on the body's responses to food and hunger and the timing of sleep, even when the overlay of modern life has made it nearly unrecognizable. The development of 3 meals a day and the cultural normalization of snacking between meals and the elimination of meaningful fasting from most people's daily experience and the extension of eating into the late night hours facilitated by artificial light and continuous food availability. These are recent developments measured against the timescale that shaped the human body. They are the product of a few thousand years of agricultural civilization and a few hundred years of industrial modernity. They have changed the human experience of eating enormously, but they have not yet had time, in evolutionary terms, to change the human body. The body that encounters the modern food environment is still, in its deep architecture, the body that was shaped by the ancient one. This is neither a tragedy nor a catastrophe. It is simply a description of where things stand. The human body is remarkably adaptable, and the diversity of dietary patterns and eating schedules across human cultures, both ancient and modern, attest to the genuine flexibility of the human metabolic system. But adaptability has limits, and the chronic diseases of metabolic dysregulation that are now among the most prevalent and costly health problems in the industrialized world suggest that those limits are being approached, if not exceeded, in the eating patterns that have become standard for large fractions of the human population. The quiet question that this story has been circling around from its beginning is not really a question about diet or nutrition in the narrow sense. It is a question about time, about the relationship between the time of the body, the deep evolutionary time that shaped the human animal over hundreds of thousands of years, and the time of history, the rapid cultural and technological changes that have transformed the human food environment in the blink of an eye by evolutionary standards, about what it means to live in a body that was designed for one world while actually inhabiting another. The forager who ate one meal a day was not practicing a dietary discipline or following a nutritional protocol. They were simply living in accordance with the rhythms of the world they inhabited. The modern person who eats 3 or 4 or more times a day is also, in an equally real sense, simply living in accordance with the rhythms of the world they inhabit. Neither is right or wrong in any absolute sense. But the mismatch between the two worlds, the world the body was built for and the world the body currently lives in, is real and consequential. And understanding it more clearly is part of the project of living wisely in a time of extraordinary abundance. There is something almost meditative about returning to that ancient eating pattern in the imagination. Not the hunger, which was real and sometimes severe and is nothing to romanticize, but the simplicity of the relationship with food that it implies. Food as something found and shared rather than purchased and consumed alone. Food is the culmination of a day's effort rather than a continuous background presence. Food as a social event, a gathering around fire rather than a private transaction. The meal as an occasion rather than a habit. The anthropologist Marshall Salins argued at a famous and controversial essay from the 1960s that hunter-gatherer societies were, in a paradoxical sense, the original affluent societies, not because they had abundant material possessions, which they did not, but because their wants were modest and their needs were, for much of the time, adequately met. They worked fewer hours per day to sustain themselves than the farmers and industrial workers who came after them. They had more time for rest, social interaction, and what might loosely be called leisure. Their relationship with food, though precarious in its way, was in other ways simpler and more direct than the laborious, anxiety-laden relationship that many modern people have with eating. Salin's argument has been criticised and qualified considerably in the decades since he made it, and the actual lives of prehistoric foragers were certainly harder and more dangerous in many ways than his essay implied. But there is a kernel of genuine insight in the idea that the simplification of the relationship with food that characterised the forager life, the reduction of eating to one main event per day, the absence of nutritional anxiety, the direct connection between physical effort and caloric reward, might have provided a kind of psychological ease with regard to food that is genuinely difficult to achieve in the modern world. The modern relationship with food is for many people complicated in ways that would be essentially unrecognizable to a Paleolithic forager. The questions of what to eat, when to eat, how much to eat, whether to eat, the navigation of dietary advice that changes constantly and often contradicts itself, the cultural weight of food as a vehicle for identity, self-control, pleasure, guilt, social status, environmental ethics, and a dozen other meanings. These complications are products of abundance and complexity. They arise in a world where food choices are nearly infinite, and nutritional information is overwhelming, and the body's ancient signals of hunger and satiety are swimming in a sea of manufactured food products, specifically designed to override them. None of this is going anywhere. The modern food environment is not going to simplify itself. The ancient rhythms of hunger and satiety are not going to reassert themselves spontaneously against the constant availability of calorie-dense food. But understanding the history, understanding what the body was designed for and what it is actually being asked to do, can at least provide a kind of perspective. A quiet awareness that the hunger you feel in the morning is not an emergency, that the sleepiness you feel after a meal is not a malfunction, that the powerful pull toward eating when good food is available is not a character flaw, that the body asking for rest and dark and the completion of its ancient digestive cycle is doing exactly what it was designed to do, in a world that increasingly makes that very difficult. The world changes. The rhythms that shape the body over hundreds of thousands of years persist. And in the space between those two facts, human beings navigate their relationship with food, with hunger, with eating and not eating, with the ancient and the modern as best they can. The fire has burned low. The group around it is mostly asleep. The darkness beyond the circle of light is vast and full of sound. Tomorrow the foraging will begin again, the long-fasted morning, the gradual gathering of food, the social culmination of the shared meal in the evening. The body knows this pattern. It has known it for longer than there has been language to describe it. And in knowing it, in feeling the ancient rhythms of hunger and satisfaction, of effort and rest, of fasting and feasting, that still move through every human body alive today, there is a kind of quiet wonder available, a recognition that the body carries within it the entire weight of its own history, the record of every morning that began in hunger, every day that ended in the warmth of fire and the satisfaction of food, shared among people who needed each other to survive. That history is not past. It is present in every cell, every hormone, every neural circuit, every gut microbe, every metabolic rhythm of every human body currently alive. The 10,000 years of agriculture, the few hundred years of industry, the few decades of processed food abundance, these have changed the conditions enormously, but they have not changed the body. Not yet. Not nearly enough to erase what 200,000 years of a different kind of living wrote into the flesh. And so the body continues to move through its ancient rhythms, even in the middle of the modern world, even surrounded by abundance and artificial light, and the constant availability of food. It fasts when it can. It hunts in the early morning with the sharpened attention that mild hunger produces. It craves the social warmth of shared food. It feels the completion of the day when the main meal is finally eaten. It seeks the darkness and the rest that the long, slow cycle of eating and fasting was always moving toward, somewhere in the background of every meal you've ever eaten. Somewhere in the physiology of every hunger you have ever felt and every satisfaction you have ever experienced from eating. The ancient forager is still present, still moving across the landscape in the early morning, still gathering what the day provides, still returning to the fire in the evening with something to share, still eating when food is found, with the full grateful attention of a body that knows at a level deeper than thought that food is not guaranteed, that hunger is real, that the meal when it comes is worth everything the day required to find it. The fire glows, the stars turn slowly overhead, the night deepens toward its quiet centre, and the body, replete and warm and ancient, lets itself rest. But before the rest comes fully, it is worth lingering a little longer in the long history that this story has been tracing, because there are dimensions of the ancient relationship with food and hunger that have not yet been fully explored, dimensions that reach into some of the most fundamental questions about what it means to be human, what the body is and what it needs, and what the long sweep of evolutionary time has to say about the experience of living in a body today. One of the most striking features of the human relationship with hunger, when examined from an evolutionary and anthropological perspective, is the degree to which hunger was not merely tolerated, but in some sense embraced, not as an end in itself, but as the necessary prelude to the satisfaction that followed. The experience of genuine hunger, hunger that builds over many hours of physical activity in the open air, hunger that sharpens the senses and focuses the attention on the landscape and on the possibilities of finding food, is an experience that is so universal and so constant in the lives of ancient humans that it would be difficult to overstate its centrality to the daily experience of being human for most of the species' history. Consider the phenomenology of hunger, the actual felt quality of it, as it would have been experienced by someone living the life of a forager 200,000 years ago. In the early morning, after a night of sleep during which the body has been drawing on its glycogen reserves, and the overnight fast has been extending the previous evening's natural post-meal fast, the sensation of hunger is present but mild. The body is not in distress. The metabolic machinery is running smoothly on stored energy. The morning light is clear, and the air is cool, and the landscape ahead holds all the potential of an unexplored day. As the morning progresses and the group moves through its territory, the hunger deepens gradually. Not painfully, not urgently, but with a steady insistence that keeps the attention engaged with the environment, that maintains the quality of alertness and interest that is the functional correlate of the biological drive to find food. Every rustle in the grass, every unusual smell carried on the wind, every track in the soil is noticed and assessed against the background of this gentle, persistent hunger. This quality of hungry attention, this specific mode of engaged, interested awareness of the environment, is something that is very difficult to access for people who eat several times a day and who rarely allow hunger to build beyond the mild discomfort of being slightly overdue for a snack. It is a different cognitive state, shaped by the activation of specific neurological circuits, different in quality from well-fed attention, neither better nor worse in absolute terms, but differently tuned, oriented outward toward the environment in a way that may have genuine adaptive value for activities that require sustained environmental monitoring. There is a certain quality of meditative stillness available in this state of mild, sustained hunger, a state of being present to the environment without the noise of satiety and the comfortable inward-turning attention that comes after eating. The hunter-gatherers who spent their mornings in this state were not experiencing deprivation in any simple sense. They were in a heightened state of biological and perceptual readiness, a state that their bodies were designed to produce and sustain, a state that represents one of the natural modes of human engagement with the world. This connection between hunger and a particular quality of wakefulness and environmental attention is reflected, interestingly, in the practices of many contemplative and spiritual traditions. The association between fasting and heightened spiritual awareness, between the deliberate emptying of the body and a certain quality of mental clarity and openness, appears across an extraordinary range of cultures and traditions. From the desert fathers of early Christianity who fasted for long periods in the wilderness, to the vision quests of various Native American traditions involving several days without food, to the systematic use of fasting in Buddhist, Hindu, and Jewish practice as a means of shifting the quality of consciousness, the connection between not eating and a certain kind of heightened, clarified awareness appears again and again in human history. It would be too simple to say that these spiritual practices of fasting are merely rediscoveries of the ancient hunters' morning attention. They are that in part, but they are also embedded in complex frameworks of meaning and intention that go far beyond the biological. Yet the biological substrate is real. The neurological and hormonal changes that occur during fasting, the shifts in neurotransmitter balance, the changes in brain energy metabolism, the actions of ghrelin and other hunger-related signals on the brain, these do produce measurable changes in subjective experience. They do alter the quality of awareness in ways that have been noticed and valued across many cultures. And those changes have their deepest roots not in spiritual aspiration, but in the simple biological reality that the body of a hunter needs to be alert and environmentally oriented when it has not yet eaten, and that the body's chemical machinery delivers exactly that quality of alertness when the stomach is empty. Returning to the anthropological record, it is interesting to examine how different hunter-gatherer societies around the world have described and conceptualized their relationship with food and hunger where such records exist. In many cases, the accounts left by early anthropologists and explorers who encountered foraging peoples in the 19th and early 20th centuries describe attitudes toward food and hunger that are strikingly different from the attitudes common in industrialized societies, where hunger is typically experienced as an unpleasant problem to be solved as quickly as possible. Many accounts describe a quality of equanimity, even cheerfulness, in the face of periods of food shortage that observers found surprising or even incomprehensible. When food was not available, foraging peoples often continued their activities with apparent good humour, neither despairing nor reducing their physical activity, apparently trusting that the landscape would eventually provide what was needed. When food was found and shared, the eating was described as genuinely joyful, a celebration rather than merely a nutritional transaction. This attitude, so different from the food anxiety that characterizes many modern people's relationship with hunger and eating, is not evidence of some superior stoicism or spiritual development in ancient peoples. It is much more likely the attitude of people whose bodies were calibrated for the conditions they were living in. People whose metabolic systems could handle extended fasting without distress. People whose neurological systems did not interpret the absence of food as an emergency, because those systems had evolved in conditions where the absence of food was normal and the body's appropriate response was continued calm engagement with the environment rather than escalating distress. The panic that many modern people feel when a meal is delayed by even an hour or two, the irritability, the difficulty concentrating, the sense of urgency that can make hunger feel like a crisis, These responses are not simply the result of genuine biological need being unmet. They are, at least in part, conditioned responses, the product of a lifetime of having hunger signals answered immediately, so that the experience of hunger has never been allowed to develop into the steady, manageable, attentionally sharpening state that was evolutionarily designed to produce. When the body has been trained to expect food within minutes of the first hunger signal, the experience of not getting food within these minutes can genuinely feel like something has gone wrong, even when, by any objective biological measure, the body is functioning perfectly well and has abundant energy reserves to draw on. The psychological relationship with hunger is thus, in an important sense, trainable. Not in the sense of simple willpower or discipline, which are themselves concepts loaded with cultural baggage, but in the sense that the body's response to hunger is modulated by experience and expectation in ways that can shift significantly over time. People who regularly practice intermittent fasting, for example, consistently report that their experience of hunger changes over the weeks and months of practice. The urgency diminishes, the irritability lessens, the ability to remain functional and comfortable through periods of hunger that would previously have felt distressing increases. This is not merely psychological adjustment, though that is part of it. It likely also involves genuine physiological adaptation, including the upregulation of fat oxidation pathways, changes in gut hormone signaling, and possibly changes in the sensitivity of hunger signaling circuits in the brain. The body, in other words, can learn to be a better hunter. It can learn to draw more efficiently on its stored energy during fasting periods. It can learn to produce the calm, attentive, manageable hunger of the ancient forager rather than the anxious, urgent, disruptive hunger of someone whose body expects continuous feeding. This learning takes time, and it requires a degree of willingness to experience hunger rather than immediately silencing it. But the capacity for this adaptation is built into the biology, because the biology was built for a world in which this is how hunger always worked. Moving further along the timeline of human eating history, it is worth spending some time with the Neolithic period, the era of early agriculture, and what the archaeological evidence reveals about how the introduction of farming changed not just the food supply, but the entire rhythm and character of human eating. The earliest farming communities, which appeared in the Fertile Crescent region of the Middle East around 10,000 years ago and spread from there across Europe, Asia and Africa over the following several thousand years, were not immediately the settled, grain-eating, regular meal-consuming communities that we might imagine. The transition from foraging to farming was gradual, and in the early stages the two subsistence strategies coexisted and overlapped. Early agricultural communities continued to forage for wild foods alongside their planted crops. The diet remained relatively diverse. The dependency on domesticated grains increased slowly over generations, but as agriculture became more intensive and more central to subsistence, the dietary consequences became more significant. The archaeological evidence is clear on this point. The bones of people from early agricultural communities show a shift toward a diet dominated by a few starchy staple crops, primarily wheat and barley in the Middle East and Europe, rice in Asia, and maize in the Americas. This dietary narrowing had both advantages and disadvantages. The advantages were primarily caloric. The ability to produce larger quantities of food from a given area of land and to store that food through seasons when wild food was unavailable. The disadvantages were nutritional. The reduction in dietary diversity led to deficiencies in certain vitamins and minerals that were more readily obtained from a diverse wild food diet. The vitamin C deficiency disease scurvy, for example, which is caused by insufficient intake of fresh fruits and vegetables, appears in the archaeological record as a significant health problem in early agricultural communities, where fresh plant food availability was more seasonal and more restricted than in foraging life. Iron deficiency anemia, which produces characteristic changes in the bones of the skull, is more common in the skeletons of early farmers than in those of their hunter-gatherer predecessors. And the dental records tell a particularly clear story, with the rates of tooth decay, caused primarily by the fermentable sugars in grain-based diets, rising sharply with the adoption of agriculture. These health costs of early agriculture were not hidden from the people who paid them. There is no reason to believe that early farmers were unaware that their lives were in some ways harder and their health in some ways worse than that of their foraging contemporaries. But advantages of agriculture, the larger and more reliable food supply, the ability to support a growing population, the possibility of accumulating property and developing the social complexity that eventually led to cities and states and all the rest of civilization, these advantages were compelling enough, or the conditions that made agriculture necessary were pressing enough that the transition occurred and continued despite the costs. What this history suggests, among other things, is that the human body's ideal nutritional conditions and the conditions that human civilization requires for its maintenance are not necessarily identical. The body was designed for dietary diversity and irregular eating. Civilization in its agricultural and industrial forms has required dietary simplification and regular scheduled eating. The compromise between these two realities has been, and continues to be, imperfect, and the imperfection shows up in the public health data. There is a long thread of human intellectual and practical history focused on the question of how to eat well, how to organize the relationship with food in a way that satisfies both the demands of the body and the demands of social and productive life. Ancient Greek physicians, writing in the tradition of Hippocrates, gave enormous attention to questions of diet and the timing of eating, recommending in many cases a relatively simple diet, with periods of deliberate restraint, arguing that the capacity of the stomach should not be tested by excessive eating, and that the body benefited from periods of digestive rest. The Galenic medical tradition, which dominated European medicine for over 1,000 years after Hippocrates, similarly emphasized moderation in eating and the importance of matching the quantity and character of food to the body's actual needs, rather than to desire or social custom. In ancient China, the Taoist medical tradition developed sophisticated ideas about the relationship between eating, health, and the life force, or qi, including practices of deliberate dietary restriction and fasting that were considered essential to health and longevity. The Yellow Emperor's Classic of Medicine, one of the foundational texts of Chinese medicine, which reached its current form around 2,000 years ago, though drawing on much older traditions, contains extensive discussion of diet and the importance of eating in harmony with the seasons and with the body's natural rhythms. The idea that eating too much, eating at the wrong times, or eating foods inappropriate to the season or to one's constitutional type could undermine health was central to this tradition. In the Islamic medical tradition, which synthesized and extended Greek, Persian, and Indian medical knowledge during the medieval period, the physician Avicenna, whose comprehensive medical text, the Canon of Medicine, was studied in European universities for several centuries, gave detailed attention to the timing and character of meals, recommending that the stomach be allowed to empty completely between meals, and that eating should be governed by genuine hunger rather than by habit or social pressure, Avicenna's recommendations for maintaining health through attention to eating patterns were remarkably consonant with what modern nutritional science is beginning to rediscover. These traditional medical insights about the importance of not eating as well as eating, about the value of periods of digestive rest, about the need to match the timing of eating to the body's natural readiness to receive and process food, these are not merely historical curiosities. They represent the accumulated observational wisdom of many generations of thoughtful physicians and healers who were watching what happened to people over the course of their lives when they ate in different ways, and who are drawing conclusions from those observations without the benefit of molecular biology or randomized controlled trials, but with the advantage of long and careful attention. The modern scientific study of fasting and its effects on health and longevity is in many ways putting rigorous experimental and mechanistic grounding under these older observations. The research on caloric restriction in model organisms, beginning with the discovery in the early 20th century that restricting caloric intake in rodents while maintaining adequate nutrition significantly extended their healthy lifespan, initiated a century of investigation into the relationship between how much and how often we eat and how long and how healthily we live. In animal models ranging from yeast to worms to flies to mice to primates, caloric restriction has consistently been found to extend lifespan and improve health span, the period of healthy, functional life, by margins that are often dramatic. Calorically restricted mice live 40 to 60% longer than their ad libitum fed counterparts under laboratory conditions. Similarly dramatic effects have been found in numerous other organisms. The mechanisms underlying these effects are now understood to include the activation of nutrient-sensing pathways, including the insulin and insulin-like growth factor signaling pathway, the mTOR pathway, and the AMPK pathway, which regulate the balance between cellular growth and reproduction on the one hand, and cellular maintenance and repair on the other. When calories are abundant and these pathways are fully activated, the body prioritizes growth and reproduction. When calories are scarce or absent, and these pathways are downregulated, the body shifts resources toward maintenance, repair, stress resistance, and what might be described as cellular housekeeping. The logic is straightforward from an evolutionary perspective. When food is abundant, it makes sense to grow, reproduce, and build. When food is scarce, it makes sense to conserve, repair, and survive until conditions improve. The long-term health consequences of keeping the body in the abundant nutrient state continuously, as modern continuous eating tends to do, may include the acceleration of the cellular damage accumulation that we call aging, and the increased vulnerability to the diseases that attend it. The research on fasting in humans is less complete than the research in model organisms for obvious ethical and practical reasons, but the available evidence points in consistent directions. Studies of religious fasting, including Ramadan in Muslim populations and various extended fasts in Christian, Buddhist, and Jewish communities, have found a range of health benefits associated with fasting periods, including improvements in blood pressure, blood glucose, lipid profiles, inflammatory markers, and body composition. Studies of caloric restriction in overweight and obese human subjects have found not only the expected improvements in metabolic markers, but also improvements in cognitive function, mood, and quality of life in many participants. And the growing literature on time-restricted eating in humans suggests that confining the daily eating window to 8 to 12 hours, with the remaining 12 to 16 hours devoted to fasting, can produce significant metabolic benefits even without deliberate restriction of total caloric intake. These findings are beginning to reshape clinical nutrition in ways that would have seemed radical not very long ago. The idea that skipping breakfast might be healthy rather than harmful, the idea that going 16 hours without eating might be beneficial rather than stressful, the idea that occasional extended fasts might have protective effects against disease and aging. These ideas are gaining scientific respectability not because they are new discoveries, but because modern research methods are finally catching up to what the evolutionary history of the species and the observational traditions of ancient medicine have been suggesting for a very long time. There is something quietly profound about this convergence. The hunter-gatherer who ate one meal a day did not know anything about insulin signaling or mTOR pathways or autophagy. But the body he inhabited had been shaped by 100,000 generations of eating that way. And it worked with that eating pattern in perfect harmony, its cellular maintenance cycles and its metabolic rhythms and its hormonal signals all calibrated for a world in which most of the day was spent in the fasted state. And food, when it came, was genuine, substantial, and social. And the modern researcher who studies intermittent fasting in a laboratory, measuring inflammatory markers and insulin sensitivity and telomere length, is in a real sense rediscovering that harmony, finding in the data the reflection of an ancient and efficient biological design. It is also worth considering the role that food played in the cognitive and cultural development of early humans, because the story of human eating is not only a story about metabolism and nutrition, it is also a story about the development of the human mind. The ability to plan future food needs, to remember where food sources were found in the past, and to reason about where they might be found in the future, to communicate this information to other members of the group, and to coordinate foraging and hunting strategies that extend over time and space. All of these cognitive capacities were powerfully selected for in the evolutionary environment of the Paleolithic. A human ancestor could remember that a particular grove of fruit trees bore ripe fruit in a specific season, and plan to return to that location at the right time had a significant advantage over one who could not. A hunter who could read the landscape for signs of animal movement, who could reason from tracks and disturbed vegetation to the likely location of prey, who could communicate this reasoning to hunting partners and coordinate a strategy that would drive the animal toward waiting hunters. This hunter was more likely to succeed, and more likely to sustain himself and his group. These cognitive capacities, memory, planning, spatial reasoning, communication, cooperation, are all deeply food-motivated in their evolutionary origins. The human brain did not grow large in a vacuum. It grew large in a specific context, the context of a highly mobile, socially cooperative, environmentally engaged foraging life, in which intelligence paid dividends in calories. The demands of finding food in a complex and variable environment, the demands of social cooperation in the collective enterprise of foraging and hunting, the demands of managing the social dynamics of a group in which everyone's survival depended on collective functioning. These were the selection pressures that drove the extraordinary expansion of the human brain over the past 2 million years. Food was not merely fuel for this cognitive development, it was the problem that drove it. The human brain's remarkable capacities for planning, memory, language, social intelligence, and environmental reasoning evolved in the service of the challenge of finding enough food, in a world that did not make that challenge easy. The relationship between hunger and intelligence is thus not merely the short-term neurological relationship that produces the hungry sharpness of a fasted morning. It is a deep evolutionary relationship running through the entire history of the human lineage, in which the persistent challenge of finding food was the main engine of cognitive evolution. The social complexity of hunter-gatherer life, which was in many ways considerably more demanding than the stereotype of the simple caveman suggests, also placed enormous cognitive demands on our ancestors. The management of reciprocal food-sharing relationships, which required keeping track of who had shared what with whom, and maintaining the complex web of obligation and credit that made collective survival possible, was itself a cognitively demanding task. The development of language may have been partly driven by the need to communicate about food, to describe where food had been found, to share information about the state of different food sources across a large territory, and to negotiate the social dynamics of sharing. The archaeological evidence for the cognitive development that were occurring during the long Paleolithic period is scattered and fragmentary, but it consistently points to a gradual elaboration of behavioural complexity that proceeded over hundreds of thousands of years. The production of more refined and varied stone tools, the use of pigments suggesting symbolic thinking, the creation of personal ornaments suggesting social signalling, the evidence of long-distance trade in raw materials suggesting networks of social relationship extending over considerable distances. All of these developments are consistent with the picture of gradually increasing cognitive sophistication in creatures whose daily lives were organised around the challenge of finding food. The meal, in this context, was not only a nutritional event and a social event, but also, in a real sense, an intellectual event. The planning that preceded it, the discussion around the fire that accompanied it, the knowledge sharing about food sources and foraging strategies that the gathering of the group facilitated, all of these made the evening meal a centre of information exchange as well as of food sharing. The hearth was the university of the Paleolithic, the place where knowledge accumulated and was transmitted from one generation to the next, the place where the collective intelligence of the group was concentrated and applied to the ongoing challenge of survival. It is interesting to note that this character of the meal as an intellectual and informational occasion persisted through the agricultural period and into historical civilization, taking forms that were more elaborate and more formalized, but recognizably descended from the original. The Symposium of Ancient Greece, the philosophical dinner party in which food and drink were the occasion for intellectual discussion, is perhaps the most famous example. The Roman convivium, the medieval feast, the Georgian dinner party, the modern conference dinner, the university high table, all of these are cultural elaborations of the ancient social function of the communal meal as an occasion not just for eating, but for the exchange of knowledge, the building of relationships, and the conduct of the social business of the community. The food itself was always partly an excuse. The real business was the gathering, the talking, the sharing of information and perspective and wit, the maintenance of the social fabric through the ritual of eating together. This is still true, of course. The business lunch, the dinner date, the family meal, the holiday feast, these are still primarily social occasions that happen to involve food, rather than primarily nutritional occasions that happen to involve people. The food provides the occasion and the setting, but the meaning is in the gathering. What is perhaps most remarkable in the end about the story of human eating is not the extraordinary diversity of what humans have eaten across different cultures and environments. But that diversity is genuinely remarkable, from the nearly all-meat diet of Arctic hunters to the nearly all-plant diet of tropical foragers, from the elaborate cuisine of classical Chinese civilization to the simple fare of desert nomads. What is most remarkable is the consistency across all of this diversity of certain fundamental features of the human relationship with food, the social character of eating. The significance of the shared meal, the importance of fire and cooking, the rhythm of hunger and satisfaction, and the deep biological architecture of the fasted morning and the evening feast, which appears across hunter-gatherer societies on every inhabited continent, and which reflects the design of a body that was made for one particular pattern of eating, and that is still, in its deepest layers, running that same ancient program. The stars overhead are the same stars that ancient humans watched from their sleeping places on the savannah. The darkness is the same darkness. The body's need for rest and warmth and food and the company of the others, these are the same needs. Everything else, the technology and the agriculture and the industrial food system and the supermarkets and the nutritional science and the intermittent fasting protocols and everything else, all of it is the elaboration that human ingenuity and human culture have built on top of a foundation that remains, after all this time, essentially what it was. One body, one life, one hunger, one fire, one meal shared among people who need each other. This is what the history returns to, always, no matter how far it travels into complexity and modernity and the extraordinary strangeness of the present. The ancient simplicity underneath, the biological fact that was there before any cultural history or knowledge existed to describe it. The fact that the body needs to eat, that it needs to be fed sometimes, and to be emptied sometimes, that it needs the company of others when it eats, that it needs the warmth of fire and the darkness of night, and the rest that follows a day of genuine effort and a meal of genuine food. These needs are not embarrassing or inconvenient remnants of a more primitive past. They are the foundation of what it means to be human, laid down over hundreds of thousands of years in the long school of evolution, taught by the hard instruction of survival, written into the body in letters too deep to be easily read but too fundamental to be ignored. And now, at the end of this long, slow journey through the history of the human meal, as the mind settles toward rest and the body takes its place in the ancient cycle of fasting and sleeping and waking, into another morning of possibility, there is something quietly beautiful available in the recognition that the hunger you feel is old, that the satisfaction of eating is older still, that the pleasure of sharing food with people you love is among the oldest human experiences there is, that the body's need for periods of rest, both active rest and the metabolic rest of the fast, is not a modern luxury or a dietary intervention, but the original rhythm of a living system that has been finding its way through the world for a very long time. The night is old. The hunger has been satisfied. The fire has become embers. And somewhere, in the deep and patient intelligence of the body, the ancient rhythms are run still. Rest now. The morning will bring its own hunger. And that hunger, when it comes, is not a problem. It is a beginning. There is one more thread worth following before sleep comes entirely. It is the thread of water. Because in the ancient world the search for food and the search for water were inseparable. They were the two organizing imperatives of the day, the two needs that structured the movement of foraging groups across the landscape, the two absences that the body felt most urgently and the two satisfactions that brought the deepest relief, and the relationship between water, food, and the timing of eating is one that modern nutritional understanding has only recently begun to appreciate fully. Hunter-gatherer groups in many environments would have gone long stretches of their day without access to water, just as they went long stretches without food. The body manages the absence of water through mechanisms that are, in their own way, as sophisticated as those that manage the absence of food. The kidneys adjust their filtration rate to conserve water. The concentration of the urine increases. The sensation of thirst, produced by signals from the hypothalamus in response to rising blood osmolality, increases in intensity as dehydration progresses, and the motivation to find water when thirst becomes acute is among the most powerful biological drives the body can produce. The experience of thirst, like the experience of hunger, was for most of human history a genuine and regular companion of daily life. Water sources in many of the environments where human ancestors lived were not continuously available. Seasonal rivers dried up. Springs could be distant from sleeping camps. Rain was unpredictable. And the work of finding water was, in many environments, as demanding as the work of finding food. The co-experience of thirst and hunger, the double emptiness of a body that needs both water and food, is something that almost no modern person in the industrialized world has experienced in any meaningful way. We drink whenever we want. Bottled water and tap water and the water content of the dozens of beverages available at every moment make the experience of genuine thirst essentially inaccessible for most modern people. And yet the body's management of water balance is still running the ancient programs, still responding to small fluctuations in hydration status with subtle changes in mood, attention and cognitive performance that most people never connect to their water intake because they never allow dehydration to develop far enough to make the connection obvious. The relationship between hunger and thirst is also physiologically interesting because the same hypothalamic circuits that regulate hunger are deeply involved in the regulation of thirst, and the signals can sometimes be confused. What presents as hunger, particularly the vague, low-grade hunger that many people experience throughout the day between meals, is often partly or entirely thirst. The body's signal for mild dehydration overlaps considerably in its phenomenology with the signal for mild caloric deficit, and in a world where water was as scarce as food, this makes perfect sense. Both signals represented genuine needs that required attention and action, and a single system capable of generating a generalized motivation to seek resources and to consume them when found served both needs simultaneously. This is one small example of the deeper principle that the body is not a collection of separate systems, each managing separate functions, but an integrated whole evolved to manage the full complexity of survival in a world where many things were needed and none of them were guaranteed. The metabolic system, the hunger system, the thirst system, the sleep system, the immune system, the stress response system, all of these are deeply interconnected, synchronized to each other and to the rhythms of the external environment, and all of them bear the marks of the world that shaped them, the ancient world of the forager, where everything was uncertain and everything was connected and the body had to manage all of it at once, continuously throughout every day and every night of a life spent in the open. That integration is still operating in every moment of every day, in every body alive on this planet. The ancient regulatory systems are running, monitoring, adjusting, coordinating. Most of the time their work is invisible beneath the threshold of consciousness, part of the background of biological function that makes conscious experience portable. But it is there. It has always been there. It was there in the first human morning 200,000 years ago, and it is there now in the deep of this quiet night, as the mind releases its hold on the day and the body takes over the long internal work of rest and repair and preparation. The history of human eating is, in the end, a history of the body learning to be itself in a world that kept changing around it. The body that was made for the savannah found itself in the river valley. The body that was made for foraging found itself farming. The body that was made for physical labour found itself sitting still. The body that was made for seasonal scarcity found itself surrounded by continuous abundance. At every step the body adapted what it could and carried forward what it could not change, and the result is the extraordinary, complicated, ancient and modern creature that reads these words now, carrying inside it the entire weight of its own history, the record of every meal and every fast, every fire and every darkness, every hunger and every satisfaction, stretching back through the generations to the very beginning of what it means to be human. Sleep comes slowly like the tide. The body is heavy and still. The mind releases its grip on the day's complications, on the questions and the answers and the long story of the species. What remains in the quiet at the edge of sleep is something simpler, the warmth of having eaten, the darkness, the sound of breathing. The ancient piece of a body that has done what bodies were made to do, moved through the world, found what it needed, shared it, and rested. This is enough. It has always been enough. Good night.